Welcome to the Embryo Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Mellinger. On this show, we explore the possibilities embryo adoption offers to families often struggling with infertility, though not always. Through insightful interviews and moving stories, we uncover the blessings of this unique path to parenthood. This podcast is brought to you by the National Embryo Donation Center, giving hope to those longing to grow their families. Now, let's get started. Moving toward a more life-affirming world for human embryos after the Alabama Supreme Court decision. That is what we're talking about today on the Embryo Adoption Podcast. My guest for this discussion is NEDC President, Medical Director, and Co-founder, Dr. Jeffrey Keenan. And Dr. Keenan, let's get right into it. I think that this case forced a lot of people to drill down more on what the phrase, "we believe life begins at conception," means. Do you think so?
Yes, I do. People, it's easy to spout a phrase off and just say, "Oh, yeah, I believe that." But what do you really mean by it, and what are the specifics? And then when is that life, worthy of being treated with all the respect and dignity that any of us should be treated with? And then finally, technically, it's not such a simple question as you might think, because abnormal fertilization occurs and other issues. But the one takeaway we can say for sure is that any of us that are here or listening to this podcast now did start at that moment of fertilization.
And I've heard you say that the DNA at conception is unchanged from the time you're born to the time, or before you're born to the time you live. If you live to be 85, 95, 105, it doesn't change.
Doesn't change. I mean, we all have mutations that occur from sun damage in different cells or whatever, but the DNA doesn't change. It remains the same from the moment that sperm fertilizes the egg.
And you mentioned, just a quick follow-up, it's not exact. There can be abnormal events that occur when you have a pregnancy achieved. You're talking about things like ectopic pregnancies that have no chance, right, of surviving to birth.
Well, yeah, I mean, an ectopic pregnancy, that can be an absolutely normal embryo, but there is no chance of surviving to birth, and it would stand a very real chance of killing the mother. And so, unfortunately, that is one of these rare cases where something needs to be done to save the life of the mother. But those are very rare cases indeed. I mean, outside of ectopic pregnancy. But what I'm talking about is, for example, where two sperm fertilize an egg, and you end up with something called a molar pregnancy. It can never, ever be a human being. Or when an abnormal number of chromosomes are in the embryo that has developed, or
Klinefelter syndrome or something.
Well, yeah, but the Klinefelters, I mean, those men are perfectly normal. I mean, you or I could be sitting here and be Klinefelters, no one would know it.
Sure.
But it would be something like a trisomy 1 or trisomy 7, which can never, ever come to birth, can never really go past several days of embryonic life. And so I think those are the things that we need to realize are just exceptions to where you would say, "Oh yes, this is full human life, deserving of all the respect that anyone should be," because we know it can never be full human life. Now, you can still treat it with respect and dignity, and in fact, any embryos we have, even if they don't develop, and we know a lot of them have chromosomal abnormalities, just statistically, that's what we know. We send them all for burial.
Yes.
But again, to say that these are children, which is what the Alabama Supreme Court said, it's just probably not accurate. I mean, terminology is important. I mean, an embryo, and then a fetus, and then an infant or newborn, and then a toddler, so that's the stages. And we don't call a 14-year-old an embryo, and we shouldn't call an embryo a child.
Yeah, all life.
Yeah.
But not necessarily all
stage.
Yeah, right. Not the same stage of life. A child is different than an embryo that's a few days old. Yeah, and I think where the rubber does meet the road on this for people before we advance with the discussion is do you believe that those cells, however many there are, whether it's just a few or a few more than that, if the embryo is a few days old, do you believe that that's human life or that it's a clump of cells? I think that this case has forced even pro-life people, even Christian believers who would consider themselves pro-life, to grapple with that question. Maybe for the first time, maybe they didn't think about, is an embryo that's only a few cells life? Is that an image bearer of God?
Yeah. And so I guess I would say a couple of things that, again, we all started that way. And so is anyone listening to this podcast, were they all that they were destined to be at that point? Yes, they were. But on the other hand, if you look at the situation that occurs in natural pregnancy and natural fertilization of an egg, from the information we have, it looks like more than 80% of fertilized eggs in the human body do not result in birth in a natural reproductive scenario.
Yeah, that's not third-party reproduction. That's just normal intercourse.
Right, that's normal intercourse. And so, again, in my opinion, the Alabama Supreme Court got it wrong in saying that all embryos are children, because, you just can't agree with that when you know what happens in natural reproduction.
And this is also why, by the way, the NEDC takes the stand that people who are working in a fertility lab should not be held liable for an accident. Now, they need to treat those embryos, and I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think this is our position. They need to treat those embryos with sanctity, dignity, with the utmost care in the lab. But if an accident occurs, we would not support them being held criminally or even civilly liable in most cases.
In most cases, yeah. And, I think the important thing is that we don't believe in genetic testing of embryos. And absent genetic testing of embryos, you don't know which embryos are genetically normal and destined to come to birth or not. And so you have to treat them all as if they are genetically normal and all have the same potential. Now, you're going to be wrong about that more often than not, to be honest with you, but there is no choice from a life-affirming perspective.
That's it. And that brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask. Were you bothered by this rush, really from both sides of the political aisle and from a lot of Christians, to defend IVF as it is mostly, generally, except for maybe our medical affiliates at Rejoice Fertility, practiced in this country? Because there are problems with IVF, although it creates great blessings too.
Right. Well, was I disappointed? Yes. Was I surprised? Not at all. Because they're both going to try to score political points or try to prevent political damage or sabotage.
Right.
And so it didn't surprise me at all. And yet they did miss an opportunity to point out that we have a lot of problems in our field with how assisted reproduction is practiced.
So is the way that assisted reproduction and IVF are widely practiced in this country, is that generally incompatible with pro-life principles?
Some parts of it, I think, yes. Other parts of it, no. I mean, we have that biblical mandate to be fruitful and multiply. And in that respect, yeah, it's 100% compatible with that Bible verse, surely. But on the other hand, generally, at clinics around the country, they think nothing of discarding embryos and or of doing genetic testing on embryos, which destroys a significant percentage of them, or at least it prevents them from implanting and growing. And they think nothing of non-biblical based unions of couples. They offer surrogacy, which has tremendous problems in and of itself. And so, yeah, there are so many things that we're doing that are not consistent with the pro-life perspective.
And I think part of this too is something that we try to preach, and that is for couples who are going to do IVF. Okay, unfortunately, it's become just standard procedure in the fertility industry for most doctors to tell those couples how it's going to be, to tell them you're going to do PGT. We're going to create more embryos than you're probably ever going to want to, quote unquote, use. And I think we at the NEDC would like to take any chance we can to tell couples who are going to go down the route of IVF, have the conversation first. Tell your physician you don't want to do PGT. You don't want to have more embryos remaining than you're going to use. They can do that, right?
They can do it. The clinic can also refuse to treat them, though, unfortunately.
Is that what usually happens?
I don't know, because we don't offer those, and so it's not an issue or a problem. I definitely have couples who have come here for embryo adoption that have said that my clinic wouldn't give me a choice. And I said, I'm not going to do it, so I'm doing embryo adoption. So I certainly have seen that, but if enough patients push back, I mean, show me the money. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of clinics are. And if they realize that they're losing a lot of patients because they won't limit the number of eggs that they inseminate, or they won't agree to do transfer of non-genetically tested embryos, then they would come around.
So put enough downward pressure on the industry. And I guess that leads to the next thing I wanted to talk about. And I know this is stuff that you're working on right now. What are some larger scale ways that the fertility industry, at least in this country, could become more life-affirming and careful in the way that it practices?
Yeah. Well, doing the things that we do at Rejoice Fertility, I think are important. We have a discussion with that couple on a lot of things. What are their chances of getting pregnant for each cycle? How many children do they want to have? You look at their history. Do they have any medical problems? Do they have any physical problems that could prevent them from having children in the future? All those things are important. Then you talk to them about, based on those factors above, how many embryos do we want to try to create? And then, although that's not entirely in your control, about 70% of inseminated eggs will become embryos. So you have a fair idea of it. And then you give that couple the option of freezing excess eggs. So
not embryos.
Not embryos, but eggs. And so that's really important because, eggs can be frozen reasonably well these days. And we certainly, and everyone now has pregnancies from frozen eggs. Many, if not most, donor egg cycles in the country use frozen eggs. And so it's a technology that has been really underutilized, and which completely avoids any of the ethical problems that having spare or unused or remaining frozen embryos causes. When couples go through IVF, they just want to have a baby so bad, and they just don't even think about anything. It's like, yeah, I'll take 50 embryos, and whatever,
understandable, right?
Whatever it takes, but then when they have been successful and had one or two or three children, whatever number that is, and they're thinking, we can't afford to have any more children. We don't have a big enough house for any more children. We're too old to have any more children, and yet we have all these genetic siblings in a liquid nitrogen canister. So it adds a real disservice to a couple that could have been prevented with these kind of discussions up front.
What about going the legal route, the legislative route? Many times the embryo adoption industry, the third-party reproduction industry in this country has been called the Wild West by the media, and I get it really is in a lot of respects. Are there legislative avenues for pursuing safeguards that would improve the nature of the fertility industry at large in this country?
Yeah, it is the Wild West here, and although our parent body says that we're one of the most regulated professions in medicine, that is absolutely not the case. And there are many, many countries that have a whole bunch of regulations.
Including in Europe, like progressive countries.
Absolutely. And so, that's just not the case. And now, on the other hand, I am not a big fan of legislation to take care of medical issues and problems, but I do think that this is one situation where I might be able to be persuaded that could be the best solution to some of these problems that we're facing. Because again, when you're asking people to do the right thing for the couple, but that's hurting their pocketbook, that's kind of hard, and you're gonna get a lot of pushback on that. But you're also going to get people pushing back and saying, well, what if you only make 3 embryos and patient doesn't get pregnant? Then you've got to use frozen eggs that don't have as good a success rate, or then you have to go through another cycle, and that harms the patient. And true enough, but if you set appropriate limits, you're going to find very little detriment to the patient, and of course potential significant upside in that patient not having to make a decision, what do I do with these embryos that I have remaining?
Right. No, it completely makes sense. It is a trade-off. Well, do you think there is, I don't know that there's an appetite for putting any legislative safeguards on it's sort of enforcing it on the fertility industry right now. To me, it seems like most of the energy and passion is toward defending the system the way it is right now. And of course, I'm sure ASRM has a very healthy lobbying arm as well. What do you think? What do you think the realistic chances are of going this direction at some point?
Yeah, it's not going to happen nationally. It's not going to happen at the federal level. But on the other hand, look what Alabama did. They basically released clinics from all liability. And what I tell patients is, okay, so now if your doctor or embryologist comes in and they partied a little too hard last night and their hands are shaking, they drop the catheter, well, too bad. Let's try it again next week.
You have no recourse.
Another $12,000 or $20,000 more likely, please. And so, yeah, you have no recourse. And so that was just a terrible solution for them to pass.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that should be walked back. It's got to be walked back. That would be insane not to walk it back, because for one thing, I'd say it's probably not constitutional, because it does not allow a couple to have the avenue to redress wrongs.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so, but on the other hand, I do think at a state level, you could have appropriate limits on assisted reproduction, just like you have in other areas. Just like, for example, there are stark differences between red and blue states on abortion legislation, and there might be on assisted reproduction too, and they would probably follow the same lines. But I do think that could be accomplished, and I do think that it would benefit the patients in those states.
So we've talked about the politics of it a little bit. We've talked about patients taking responsibility for their care. We've talked about how clinics may or may not respond to all this. As we move toward wrapping it up and thinking about what a more life-affirming world for human embryos would look like, what role do you think churches, if any, have to play in this?
Yeah, well, I mean, the church, although the church is struggling in a lot of places now, still has a big influence and can have a big impact. But you'd have to get a coordinated movement going where churches address this as part of pro-life activities and legislation. And also, it's just the churches can help educate folks on some of these things that aren't otherwise aware. So, yeah, I think the churches could have an impact. How big is hard to say, but I think it can be significant.
Well, I guess that's my bigger question is, do you think that this is a moment, or maybe the start of a moment, when conservative Christians and pro-life people can come together and get a unified position, come together behind a unified position upon ethical third-party reproduction, what that would look like?
Yeah, I think there would have to be a whole lot of negotiation with this, because people are going to come at it from different perspectives. But I'm actually working with a few groups now, some national entities, to try to develop model legislation that could be introduced at the state legislature level.
We'll look forward to that. And anything that's part of this discussion that we haven't gotten to today that you thought was important, Dr. Keenan? I always like to give all of our guests that opportunity at the end. I'll give it to you too.
Yeah, no, I would just really encourage, I mean, a lot of patients or people watching this are really interested in embryo adoption, but you're going to have friends going through IVF. Talk to them about all of these issues. Have them speak to their physicians. Don't let them be in that agonizing position, or at least don't increase the odds of being in that agonizing position where you're saying, my family is complete and I've got embryos in the freezer. So that's what I would encourage.
Yeah, we're here for them if they do have embryos in the freezer, but we're one of those nonprofits that would love to see a day when
Put ourselves out of business.
Yeah, when there's no need for us. Right. Dr. Jeffrey Keenan, thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much for listening to the Embryo Adoption Podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning more about this life-changing option for building a family. Hey, if you or someone you know could benefit from embryo adoption or donation, visit embryodonation.org to get started or just to find out more. Again, that's embryodonation.org. And don't forget to spread the word, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Join me next time as we continue sharing inspirational stories of the embryo adoption journey. And until then, take care.